In the summer of 1944, the world watched the continent burn. The hedgerows of Normandy, peaceful fields that had survived centuries of history, were about to witness one of the most violent transformations of the Second World War. Entire divisions would be erased. Veterans of the desert, the Eastern Front in North Africa, would face a weapon they had never truly feared: the overwhelming force of American air power. This is a story of a division born from Germany's finest instructors, commanded by a man who had survived every battlefield the 20th century had unleashed, yet could not survive what came from the sky. This is the destruction of Panzer, the elite German armored division crushed under the weight of Operation Cobra. Welcome to Wartime Zone, where we uncovered battles, decisions, and human stories that shaped the fate of nations. In January 2025, the world did not simply witness another election. It witnessed a shift so profound that it altered the psychological balance of global power. When Donald Trump returned to White House, everything that had been assumed, predicted, or planned by diplomats, generals, economists, and strategists was suddenly thrown into question. His victory was not a quiet transition of authority. It was a geopolitical thunderclap. And standing beside him, as the new Vice President of the United States, was J.D. Vance, a rising political figure whose worldview diverged sharply from decades of established American foreign policy. Together, they represented a leadership that did not merely intend to adjust America's role in the world. They intended to redefine it entirely. For millions of Americans who had grown tired of foreign wars, endless spending, and global obligations, it felt like the beginning of something new, a return to a simpler, narrower vision of national interest, a moment when domestic priorities would outweigh the needs of distant nations. When Trump declared it was time for America to stop playing the world's policeman, his supporters applauded with overwhelming enthusiasm. They believed this was not retreat. It was relief, a long-awaited correction to decades of costly entanglements, a movement to seal America's borders, rebuild its economy, and focus on its own people. To them, this leadership did not represent withdrawal. It represented restoration. But nearly 5,000 miles across the Atlantic, in a war-ravaged nation fighting for its survival, the reaction was the opposite. In Ukraine, the 2025 U.S. election results landed with a heaviness that could be felt everywhere, from military command centers to frontline trenches to homes already scarred by years of Russian strikes. For Ukrainian soldiers, the news was a chill that cut deeper than the winter wind. For politicians in Kyiv, it was the arrival of a crisis they had feared for months but hoped would never come. For civilians, it was another reminder that their fate was tied not only to the battlefield, but to political decisions made in faraway capitals. Within days of taking office, the new U.S. administration sent a message to Kyiv that struck at the center of Ukraine's war effort. America would no longer bankroll Ukraine's battlefield operations. There would be no more massive aid packages, no more emergency replenishment of artillery shells, no more shipments of armored vehicles or air defense missiles. The United States, the indispensable nation whose support had kept Ukraine fighting, was pulling back, not gradually, not cautiously, but decisively. Instead, Washington introduced a doctrine they called burden shifting. The argument was simple. Europe had more to lose from the war. Therefore, Europe must take the lead. It was Europe's neighborhood, Europe's danger, Europe's responsibility. America, the administration argued, had carried the burden long enough, and now it was time for others to step forward. To supporters inside the United States, this reasoning sounded perfectly rational. It matched their belief that America had been stretched too thin, that its resources had been drained by global commitments, that its people were exhausted by foreign conflicts. It echoed their frustration with endless aid bills and limited domestic improvements. It felt like a clear-eyed dose of realism. But in Kyiv, the meaning of burden shifting was brutal. It meant the battlefield was about to tilt in Russia's favor. It meant air defenses would suffer. Ammunition supplies would shrink. Ukrainian soldiers would face Russian assaults with fewer weapons, fewer tools, fewer lifelines. For Ukraine, this wasn't a doctrine. It was a warning. Inside Ukraine's military headquarters, deep beneath the city of Kyiv, emergency meetings erupted. Generals pored over maps showing frontline positions already strained by continuous Russian pressure. Intelligence officers calculated how long Ukraine's air defenses could hold without new American interceptors. Economists warned leaders that Ukraine's wartime economy was far too weak to sustain large-scale weapon production, and political advisors tried to reassure President Zelensky, even as they privately feared the worst. The most alarming question of all had no comforting answer. How long could Ukraine survive without American aid? Analysts had no illusions. Ukraine had fought fiercely. Its soldiers were resilient. Its officers had adapted quickly, learning to use Western weapons more effectively than many armies. But the brutal math of war was unforgiving. Ammunition, artillery, and air defense, these were the pillars of Ukraine's survival. Without them, no amount of courage could hold the lines forever. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the reaction was very different. For Russia, the U.S. decision was not merely encouraging, it was transformative. For years, Russia had fought a war of attrition, counting on one strategic assumption. Eventually, the West would tire. Eventually, Western governments would fight among themselves. Eventually, political shifts in Europe or the United States would weaken Ukraine's support. And eventually, the battlefield would tilt. Now, that moment seemed to be arriving. Putin and his generals watched the American policy reversal with cold, unwavering satisfaction. They understood that a war is not won by simply overpowering the enemy. It is won by outlasting the enemy's supporters. If Ukraine's supply chain fractured, the front lines would crumble. If air defenses were depleted, Russian missiles would strike deeper, harder, more frequently. If ammunition ran low, Russian forces could push forward with renewed confidence. For nearly 3 years, Russia had struggled to advance more than a few kilometers at a time. Now, they saw an opportunity to reshape the war, to push Ukraine back, to force negotiations on their terms, to reclaim the initiative. Across Europe, panic spread. Nations like Poland, the Baltic states, and the United Kingdom immediately urged collective action. They warned that Ukraine's collapse would not stop at its borders. It would embolden Russia. It would destabilize Europe. It would shatter NATO's credibility. And it would send a message to every authoritarian regime in the world. Western support is temporary. Western resolve can be broken. Western unity can be divided. But Europe, despite its alarm, faced its own limitations. Many governments struggle with stretched budgets, high energy costs, and political divisions. Some questioned whether Ukraine could still win. Others feared the consequences of appearing too confrontational with Russia. And even the countries most willing to help lacked the industrial capacity to replace the scale of American support. The reality was clear. Europe wanted help, but Europe could not fully replace the United States. Not quickly, not effectively, and not at the scale Ukraine required. The consequences of this were immediate. Stockpiles of artillery shells, already low, shrunk further. Air defense ammunition, critical for protecting cities from Russian missile strikes, began running dangerously thin. Ukrainian commanders on the front line sent increasingly urgent requests for supplies. And for the first time since 2022, those requests were met with silence. Beyond Europe, the shockwave spread across the world. NATO allies worried that America's shift signaled a weakening commitment to the alliance itself. Countries in Asia, especially Japan and South Korea, recalculated their defense strategies, wondering if they too might one day face a reduced American presence. And adversaries in Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang studied the moment carefully, seeing in it the possibility of a new, more fragmented global order. Because power is not merely measured by weapons, it is measured by willingness. And the willingness of the United States was changing. In Kiev, the emotional impact was profound. Soldiers on the front lines whispered about what the future might hold. Civilians wondered if their homes would be left undefended. Volunteers questioned whether the war effort could continue. And political leaders struggled to maintain public confidence, even as they grappled with the fear that the lifeline they had depended on had been cut. With the United States stepping back, Ukraine faced the darkest strategic landscape since the first days of the war. Its survival was no longer guaranteed. Its position was no longer secure. And its future was no longer a matter of military strength alone. It was now a race against time. When the world looked back on January 2025, it did not see a simple change in government. It saw the moment when the trajectory of an entire war shifted, a moment when alliances trembled, when adversaries sensed opportunity, when Ukraine realized that it was entering a new, more dangerous chapter, a chapter defined not by what it could gain, but by how long it could endure. This was the beginning of a new phase, a darker one, a phase where political decisions carried the weight of life and death, a phase where the survival of a nation depended not on promises, but on resources, not on words, but on actions, not on expressions of solidarity, but on the hard, unforgiving reality of war. The first weeks after the U.S. policy shift were a blur of tension and uncertainty in Kiev. The rhythm of daily life, already punctuated by sirens and shelling, now carried an added layer of fear, the fear of scarcity. Ukrainian factories, which had been ramping up production of ammunition and defensive equipment with American support, suddenly found themselves facing shortages of key components. Engineers worked around the clock, improvising solutions to maintain production, but the bottlenecks were impossible to fully overcome. Supply chains, meticulously coordinated with Western logistics experts, faltered almost immediately, creating gaps in the frontline defenses that Russian commanders were quick to notice and exploit. Every shipment delayed or canceled became a potential turning point on the battlefield. Every empty crate and depleted stockpile became a symbol of vulnerability. Soldiers who had previously relied on a steady influx of weapons and protective gear now faced a harsh reality. They would have to make do with what they had, and that meant taking greater risks, improvising under fire, and stretching their already exhausted resources to the breaking point. The psychological toll on the troops was immense. Morale, already fragile after years of continuous combat, began to show cracks. Conversations between soldiers in trenches revealed a growing sense of apprehension. Questions that had previously been unspoken now surfaced openly. How long can we hold this line? What will happen if our supplies run out entirely? Will we be abandoned in the middle of a battlefield we defended at such a heavy cost? These questions were not just rhetorical. They shaped decisions in real time. Commanders had to weigh the risk of sending soldiers into combat with limited ammunition against the potential cost of retreat. They had to calculate which positions were essential and which could be sacrificed. Every decision was now a delicate balance between strategic necessity and human survival. In parallel, the Ukrainian government faced a political crisis of unprecedented magnitude. President Zelensky, who had built much of his public image on steadfast resistance and defiance in the face of Russian aggression, suddenly confronted a challenge far beyond the battlefield. How could he assure his citizens that Ukraine would survive when the country's most powerful ally had effectively reduced its support? How could he maintain unity among political factions that were now openly debating whether to negotiate with Russia under far less favorable conditions? And perhaps most importantly, how could he prevent despair from spreading among the population, which had already endured years of trauma, displacement, and loss? In the international arena, Ukraine's situation became a litmus test for global diplomacy. European nations scrambled to fill the gap left by the United States, but their responses were uneven and constrained by internal political and economic pressures. Germany, facing both domestic opposition to deeper involvement and the logistical challenge of sending heavy weaponry, hesitated in ways that frustrated Ukrainian officials. Poland, more willing to act, nevertheless lacked the industrial capacity to provide the scale of support Ukraine needed. The United Kingdom pledged symbolic support, but the delivery of tangible assets was slow and fragmented. Brussels, attempting to coordinate collective action through the EU and NATO, struggled with bureaucratic inertia and competing national interests. Each delay, each compromise, and each half-measure translated directly into risk on the front lines. Meanwhile, Russia capitalized on every weakness it perceived. Using intelligence gathered over years of surveillance and open-source observation, Russian forces identified sectors of the Ukrainian front that were most vulnerable. They adjusted artillery barges to exploit depleted air defenses, coordinated missile strikes against critical infrastructure, and intensified cyber attacks designed to further disrupt military logistics and communications. Russian generals, confident that the United States would no longer intervene decisively, pressed harder in areas where Ukrainian forces had previously been able to mount a credible defense. The tempo of attacks increased, And with each advance, the psychological impact on Ukrainian civilians and soldiers alike grew heavier. Fear, fatigue, and uncertainty began to seep into every corner of the conflict, compounding the physical threat with a nearly invisible, yet equally lethal psychological one. Within Ukraine's military command, improvisation became a daily necessity. Tactical innovations, while impressive, were born of desperation rather than choice. Units began to consolidate positions, abandoning forward outposts that were previously defended to the last man in order to concentrate resources on sectors that could still hold. Ammunition was rationed meticulously, sometimes down to individual rounds per soldier per engagement. Engineers and mechanics worked under constant threat of bombardment, repairing vehicles and artillery pieces with whatever parts they could salvage from damaged equipment. Intelligence officers scoured intercepted communications for indications of Russian intent, knowing that the margin for error had shrunk drastically. Every success was measured in survival rather than victory, and every loss carried the weight of an existential threat. The civilian population, meanwhile, faced its own version of the battlefield. Hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties. Food supplies were strained, and families who had already endured years of uncertainty now confronted the prospect of prolonged siege conditions. Air raid shelters, once temporary precautions, became daily refuges as missile strikes intensified. School schedules, public services, and even municipal governance had to adapt to the realities of life under sustained attack. Volunteer networks expanded to provide humanitarian aid, but resources were finite and exhaustion was universal. Communities relied on collective resilience. Yet the constant threat of disruption created an environment in which hope itself became a scarce commodity. At the same time, the international media focused increasingly on the perceived fragility of Ukraine's position. Headlines emphasized the reduction of American support and speculated about the inevitability of a Russian advance. Social media amplified both factual reports and unverified rumors, creating a climate of uncertainty that spread as quickly as the news itself. Public perception mattered because it influenced political will. The sense that Ukraine could be abandoned undermined both internal morale and external support. For Kiev, managing this perception was as crucial as managing military logistics. Every statement from government officials, every public demonstration of resolve, every strategic move needed to reassure both citizens and allies that Ukraine had not lost the fight, even as the reality on the ground became increasingly precarious. Back in the United States, the Trump administration framed its policy as pragmatic and necessary. Advisors argued that continued financial and military support for Ukraine came at the expense of American domestic priorities. Infrastructure projects, economic stimulus measures, and social programs, they asserted, could now be fully funded with resources previously earmarked for foreign aid. Supporters of the administration celebrated the decision as an act of economic realism, a return to national sovereignty, and a bold assertion of American independence. Critics, however, warned that the withdrawal would have long-term consequences not only for Ukraine, but for the credibility of the United States as a global power. They argued that the perception of unreliability would embolden adversaries and weaken alliances, potentially destabilizing multiple regions beyond Eastern Europe. The unfolding crisis also illuminated the complexity of modern warfare, where the lines between military action, political decision-making, and economic influence are increasingly intertwined. The U.S. withdrawal did not merely reduce the number of weapons entering Ukraine. It disrupted the entire ecosystem of support that had been built over years. Training programs, intelligence sharing networks, logistical coordination, and maintenance pipelines, all of these were intricately linked to American engagement. When that engagement was reduced, the cumulative effect rippled through every layer of Ukraine's defense structure. It was a stark reminder that in modern conflicts, power is measured not just by troops and artillery, but by the depth, reliability, and integration of support systems. Despite the mounting challenges, Ukraine's leadership refused to concede defeat. President Zelensky and his senior advisors understood that a symbolic collapse could be as damaging as a military one. They emphasized national unity, reinforced public messaging about resilience, and sought to cultivate alternative channels of support wherever possible. Regional governors coordinated emergency measures to sustain essential services, while military leaders devised contingency plans to protect key population centers and critical infrastructure. Volunteer groups, NGOs, and private citizens mobilized in unprecedented ways, filling gaps left by the reduction in international aid. Resourcefulness became a survival skill, and innovation became a tool of necessity rather than preference. By March 2025, the cumulative impact of the U.S. policy shift and the corresponding changes on the battlefield became unmistakable. Russian forces made incremental territorial gains, exploiting weaknesses that had previously been contained. Missile strikes and artillery barrages inflicted heavier damage, while Ukrainian defenders increasingly had to choose which positions to hold and which to abandon. Each day, each operation became a contest of endurance, and with every advance by Russian forces, the global calculus shifted. Nations watched closely, assessing the balance of power, considering interventions, and preparing for the possibility that the conflict could escalate beyond Ukraine's borders. The conflict also accelerated technological adaptation. Drones, satellite imagery, and cyber operations became integral to both Ukrainian and Russian strategies. Ukrainian units leveraged small drones for reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and supply monitoring, often relying on improvised techniques to maximize effectiveness. Cyber teams worked to protect critical infrastructure, while intelligence officers monitored Russian communications for indications of strategic intent. These technological adaptations underscore a broader truth. In modern warfare, success increasingly depended on the ability to integrate new capabilities rapidly, often in conditions of scarcity and improvisation. The global ramifications of the conflict continue to unfold. U.S. disengagement had sent a ripple through international politics, influencing debates on foreign policy, alliance reliability, and deterrence. European nations weighed economic and military commitments against domestic political pressures. Neighboring countries assessed the risk of spillover, displacement, and potential escalation. Every diplomatic gesture, military deployment, and policy statement was scrutinized for its implications on the larger balance of power. Ukraine, caught at the epicenter, became both a testing ground for modern conflict and a symbol of resistance against a larger, better-equipped adversary. Despite the immense challenges, Ukrainian forces and citizens demonstrated an extraordinary ability to endure. Communities adapted to prolonged disruption. Soldiers learned to fight with ingenuity, and leadership navigated a complex web of domestic and international pressures. Each day brought new hardships, new dangers, and new opportunities for resourcefulness. The conflict had entered a phase where survival, adaptability, and psychological resilience became as critical as weaponry and strategy. The summer of 2025 was not defined by decisive victories or sweeping defeats, but by a relentless struggle to maintain cohesion, defend territory, and preserve hope in the face of overwhelming odds. The stage was set for the months ahead. The war would continue to test Ukraine's military, political, and social structures to their limits. International actors would respond, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes decisively, shaping the trajectory of both the conflict and broader geopolitical stability. And within Ukraine, every individual, from soldiers on the front line to civilians in bomb shelters, would confront the harsh realities of endurance, improvisation, and courage under pressure. The summer of 2025 had solidified the central truth of the war. Survival was not guaranteed, and every action, decision, and resource carried profound consequences. The unfolding struggle was no longer just about territory. It was about the capacity of a nation to endure when the world's eyes were simultaneously watching, judging, and hesitating. As autumn of 2025 settled over Ukraine, the landscape of the conflict shifted yet again, carrying with it new dangers, strategic recalibrations, and escalating human suffering. The early warmth of summer gave way to cold, damp winds that penetrated trenches, ruined equipment, and slowed movement along the front lines. Mud replaced dust, and frozen rivers and marshes became both obstacles and strategic considerations in the planning of operations. Ukrainian forces, already stretched thin by the summer's relentless fighting, had to contend not only with Russian offensives, but also with the increasingly unforgiving terrain. Logistics became a nightmare. Fuel and ammunition had to be transported over muddy roads, convoys slowed by ice, and the winterization of vehicles and shelters demanded scarce resources. The human toll of the season was immediate. Soldiers fell ill from exposure, Frostbite and respiratory infections spread rapidly in overcrowded and inadequately heated posts, and medical facilities, already strained, struggled to keep pace with both combat and illness-related casualties. Despite these hardships, Ukrainian forces demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation. Commanders modified tactics to account for terrain and weather. Mobile units relied more on smaller, lighter vehicles that could navigate treacherous roads. Infantry squads developed systems for quickly establishing winter defenses, using local materials to reinforce positions. And artillery units innovated methods to keep guns operational in freezing conditions, including improvised heating and lubrication methods. The improvisational spirit that had emerged in the summer persisted, and Ukrainian troops became increasingly adept at fighting under austere conditions. Small, agile units executed ambushes and raids, exploiting intelligence from drones and local informants, and slowing Russian advances with minimal resources. Every engagement required creativity. The difference between success and disaster often hinged on minute details, such as knowing which frozen river crossings could support convoy of tanks or which local villages could provide emergency shelter for exhausted troops. Russian forces, aware of the season's challenges, adapted as well. They attempted deeper penetrations, leveraging artillery bombardments to dislodge entrenched Ukrainian units, while employing winterized tanks and mechanized formations to take advantage of predictable supply routes. Russian intelligence intensified efforts to identify Ukrainian weaknesses exacerbated by resource scarcity and seasonal strain. The battles became increasingly attritional, with neither side gaining decisive ground, and the human cost skyrocketed. Civilians were caught in the middle. Many towns and villages along the front line faced constant bombardment. Evacuations became perilous in freezing weather, and humanitarian corridors were often blocked or ignored. The cold magnified the suffering of the population. Shelters were inadequate, food distribution became erratic, and illnesses that might have been manageable in warmer months escalated into fatal complications. The combination of violence, deprivation, and extreme weather created a cycle of hardship that tested both the physical endurance and the psychological resilience of all involved. The international dimension of the conflict became increasingly urgent as the scale of the humanitarian crisis became clear. European nations and global organizations issued repeated appeals for aid, but delivery was complicated by the ongoing combat and infrastructure destruction. Roads, bridges, and rail lines that had survived summer operations were damaged or blocked by shelling, making supply lines precarious. NATO, already cautious in its approach, increased intelligence sharing and non-combat support, but avoided direct military engagement. The political calculus was delicate. Any overt support could trigger escalation, while inaction risked humanitarian catastrophe and reputational damage. Global media coverage brought the war into the homes of millions, amplifying pressure on governments to respond. Public opinion, both in Europe and the United States, was divided between compassion for the victims and fear of escalation. This uncertainty forced Ukraine's leadership to navigate a complex diplomatic landscape, while simultaneously managing the day-to-day realities of defense and survival. Through it all, one theme remained constant. Survival was no longer a matter of simple bravery or tactical skill. It was a test of adaptability, resourcefulness, and the ability to endure in the face of systemic challenges. Ukraine had fought for years against a stronger, better-equipped adversary, and now was forced to fight not just against the enemy, but against the limitations imposed by geopolitics, logistics, and time. Every decision carried monumental consequences. Every action could tip the scales, and every day represented a precarious balance between resistance and collapse. The months that followed would define not only the future of Ukraine, but the broader trajectory of global politics. The United States, by choosing to prioritize domestic agendas over foreign engagement, had set in motion a chain of events that would be felt far beyond the battlefield. European nations, constrained by both resources and political will, would be forced to adapt quickly or risk strategic exposure. Russia, sensing opportunity, would continue to press forward with calculated aggression, and Ukraine, caught in the center of this geopolitical storm, would be tested in ways that few outside its borders could fully comprehend. It was a conflict that had become as much about the global order as it was about territory, sovereignty, and survival, a war in which the decisions of distant leaders could determine the fate of a nation at the front line of history. By the summer of 2025, the battlefield had shifted in both geography and psychology. The initial shock of the U.S. support reduction had worn off, replaced by a grim determination among Ukrainian forces and civilians alike. Yet determination alone could not replace the material resources that were now in short supply. Frontline units were operating under conditions that would have been considered unsustainable just months earlier. Ammunition stockpiles were carefully rationed. Vehicles were pushed far beyond normal maintenance cycles. Artillery units often fired salvage shells or improvised munitions. Soldiers learned to adapt, becoming experts in improvisation, from creating makeshift barricades to repurposing damaged equipment for new tactical uses. Every innovation was born of necessity, and every day demanded a blend of tactical acumen, endurance, and creativity. Civilian life in Kiev and other urban centers was defined by resilience and improvisation as well. Schools, offices, and public spaces had been repurposed as shelters or command posts. Families rotated through bomb shelters, balancing the need for safety with the necessity of maintaining some semblance of normal life. Markets operated on irregular schedules. Supply chains were unreliable, and the economy contracted sharply as both production and trade faced continuous disruption. Amid this hardship, a new social fabric emerged. Volunteer networks flourished, local militias organized to protect neighborhoods, and communication networks, both formal and informal, became lifelines of survival. Ukrainians learned to rely on each other in ways that were both practical and deeply symbolic, forming bonds forged in adversity. Military operations became increasingly fluid and unpredictable. Russian forces, emboldened by intelligence reports and perception of reduced Western involvement, began conducting more aggressive offensives. They used combined arms strategies, integrating artillery, airstrikes, and ground assaults in ways that tested the limits of Ukrainian coordination. Yet Ukrainian commanders responded with ingenuity, using terrain knowledge, local support networks, and unconventional tactics to slow advances and inflict disproportionate costs. Small unit actions, ambushes, and precision strikes became crucial to offset the disadvantages imposed by limited resources. Each engagement was a delicate balance, the risk of overextension against a strategic imperative to hold key positions. Losses were inevitable, but the ability to adapt became a defining factor in survival. At the same time, the political landscape, both within Ukraine and internationally, grew more complex. President Zelensky faced constant pressure from opposition parties, regional governors, and civic leaders, all of whom demanded solutions to the worsening conditions. Public trust, already strained by the hardships of war, had to be continually nurtured through transparent communication and tangible acts of leadership. In parallel, Ukraine's diplomats worked tirelessly to secure alternative channels of support, negotiating with European nations, non-governmental organizations, and private sector entities to supplement the shortfall caused by the U.S. drawdown. These efforts were critical but fraught with uncertainty. Aid arrived slowly, was often insufficient, and sometimes came with political strings that required careful navigation. Internationally, the conflict became a proxy for global power dynamics. Europe wrestled with the tension between moral obligation and domestic politics, debating how much risk to assume in the face of a determined aggressor. Germany, France, and the UK increased humanitarian and logistical support, but hesitated to commit fully to combat operations, fearing domestic backlash and escalation. NATO, constrained by consensus requirements, offered limited joint operations and intelligence sharing, but operational cohesion was uneven. Russia, interpreting these hesitations as weakness, escalated pressure along multiple fronts, seeking both territorial gains and psychological dominance. The world watched closely, acutely aware that Ukraine's struggle was more than regional. It was a measure of global resolve and the credibility of alliances. Within Ukraine, the strain was felt acutely among the military and civilian populations alike. Soldiers confronted the dual burdens of combat and resource scarcity, making rapid, life-and-death decisions under extreme stress. Commanders had to balance offensive ambitions with the stark reality of limited ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. Casualties mounted, and evacuation of the wounded became an increasingly complex logistical challenge. Civilians faced prolonged disruptions to electricity, water, and medical services, further intensifying the sense of uncertainty. Yet the resilience of both groups remained remarkable. Improvised supply chains, local ingenuity, and community solidarity helped offset the absence of full-scale international support, demonstrating the enduring human capacity to endure hardship under extreme circumstances. By mid-2025, the war had become as much a psychological struggle as a physical one. The Russian strategy increasingly relied on eroding morale, both among the military and the civilian population. Persistent bombardment, selective territorial advances, and information campaigns aimed to create doubt, fear, and fatigue. Ukrainian leadership countered with messaging emphasizing resilience, national identity, and shared sacrifice. Media outlets within the country highlighted stories of heroism, community solidarity, and tactical ingenuity, helping maintain morale despite the relentless pressure. Social media became a battlefield of perception, where misinformation, propaganda, and motivational narratives competed for influence over both domestic and international audiences. By late autumn, the war had entered a phase characterized by high-intensity skirmishes, targeted offensives, and sporadic but devastating artillery strikes. Both sides relied increasingly on intelligence-driven operations. Drones, reconnaissance teams, and cyber operations informed precision strikes aimed at critical logistics hubs, command posts, and supply depots. Ukrainian forces, despite the depletion of their resources, used local knowledge and tactical ingenuity to mitigate some of the technological advantages of the Russians. For example, forested and urban areas were transformed into fortified networks of ambush points and fallback positions. Supply caches were dispersed to prevent catastrophic losses from bombardments, and communication networks became more decentralized, relying on runners, shortwave radios, and encrypted messages. The psychological dimension of the conflict became as important as the physical. Maintaining morale among troops and civilians alike was critical to preventing collapse under relentless pressure. As the first snows arrived, combat became even more arduous. Frost and snow slowed movement, and supply convoys were at greater risk from ambushes, mines, and artillery fire. Both sides faced attrition from the elements as much as from bullets and shells. Ukrainian troops, often without adequate winter clothing or shelter, adapted through improvisation, sleeping in foxholes reinforced with straw, using fire pits cautiously to avoid detection, and melting snow for water. Engineers worked tirelessly to keep bridges open, repair roads, and maintain the flow of ammunition and food. Civilians, meanwhile, became part of the survival equation, providing shelter, food, and intelligence to Ukrainian forces. These networks of collaboration were essential to sustaining the front lines, and every act of aid, however small, had a direct impact on the war effort. The winter months also saw a rise in asymmetric tactics. Ukrainian units increasingly used small-scale sabotage, targeted strikes, and rapid raids to disrupt Russian supply lines and morale. Mines and improvised explosive devices became widespread along key routes. Russian columns, often slowed by weather and terrain, were vulnerable to ambushes that inflicted significant casualties and equipment losses. These actions did not always produce decisive victories, but had a cumulative effect, slowing the momentum of Russian operations and buying critical time for Ukrainian commanders to reorganize, reinforce, and plan counteroffensives. Morale became a weapon in itself. Each successful raid or defense strengthened confidence and hardened resolve, offsetting some of the disadvantages imposed by the material shortages and harsh conditions. Throughout autumn and winter, the civilian population bore an increasing burden. Evacuations were complex, often leaving families stranded between front lines or forced to move repeatedly. Food, medicine, and heating were scarce, and hospitals were overwhelmed by both combat and illness-related cases. International humanitarian organizations attempted to provide assistance, but access was limited by the ongoing fighting and destruction of infrastructure. Communities relied on local leadership and volunteer networks to coordinate aid, distribute resources, and maintain essential services. This civilian resilience became an integral component of Ukraine's defensive strategy. By sustaining the population, they sustained the capacity of the military to continue fighting. By the end of 2025, the conflict had evolved into a brutal war of endurance. Ukrainian forces had adapted to challenges of supply shortages, weather and relentless pressure, developing innovative tactics, local intelligence networks, and improvised logistics systems. Russian forces, while better equipped, face increasing difficulties in maintaining momentum, especially as attrition, terrain, and unpredictable resistance slowed their advances. Civilians endured immense hardships but became active participants in the defense and survival of their communities. Politically, Ukraine maintained fragile support from international partners, balancing diplomatic efforts with the immediate demands of survival and combat. The war's human cost continued to rise, with each month bringing new stories of sacrifice, courage, and loss. The autumn and winter of 2025 highlighted the changing nature of modern warfare. Success depended not only on conventional firepower, but on adaptability, local knowledge, resourcefulness, and psychological resilience. The conflict demonstrated that determination and ingenuity could partially offset disadvantages in technology and supply, but that human endurance has limits. By the close of the year, both sides are preparing for the next phase of the struggle, aware that the coming spring would bring renewed offensives, new strategies, and a continued test of will's skill and survival. The lessons of autumn and winter were clear. In a war defined by attrition, adaptability, and the human spirit could become as decisive as tanks, artillery, and drones. As spring 2026 approached, the thawing of the frozen landscape brought both relief and new dangers to the Ukrainian front. Rivers swelled with melting snow, roads turned to mud, and previously impassable forests became accessible again, creating new avenues for both defense and attack. Ukrainian forces had spent the winter reinforcing positions, stockpiling supplies, and reorganizing their units after months of attritional warfare. Morale, though battered by the long months of hardship, showed resilience, buoyed by small tactical victories and the steadfastness of civilian support networks. The Russian military, meanwhile, sought to capitalize on the seasonal changes, planning renewed offensives with mechanized units that could exploit thawed routes and temporary bridges across rivers. Both sides understood that spring would be decisive. Delays could mean being bogged down by mud, disrupted logistics, and stretched resources before summer campaigns could commence. The early spring months were marked by intense reconnaissance and preparation. Ukrainian drones scouted river crossings, road networks, and potential staging areas, while intelligence units mapped Russian troop movements and supply depots. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair roads, fortify positions, and establish in supply caches, often under fire. Civilians played a crucial role in guiding troops, maintaining local knowledge of the terrain, and providing intelligence on enemy movements. Winter had tested the endurance of both the military and the population, but the adaptive strategies developed during those months now became the foundation for spring operations. Commanders emphasized mobility, coordination, and precision strikes to counter Russian advantages in heavy equipment and artillery. Small units, agile and familiar with the terrain, became essential tools for disrupting enemy advances, staging ambushes, and gathering critical information. The fighting in spring quickly escalated into brutal engagements. Russian forces pushed hard along several axes, attempting to exploit thawed terrain for rapid mechanized movements, but Ukrainian defenders employed innovative tactics to counter these efforts. Mines, improvised explosive devices, and guerrilla-style ambushes targeted supply lines and mechanized columns, slowing progress and inflicting substantial losses. Artillery exchanges intensified, often concentrated on choke points such as bridges, river crossings, and small urban centers that could dictate regional control. Civilian settlements near the front bore the brunt of these operations, with widespread displacement, infrastructure destruction, and the ongoing struggle for essentials such as food, water, and medical care. International humanitarian efforts increased, but were constrained by active combat zones, logistical challenges, and security concerns. The human toll mounted, with casualties not only from direct combat, but also from exposure, malnutrition, and untreated injuries. Despite material shortages, Ukrainian forces demonstrated a remarkable capacity for resilience and adaptation. Units operated with decentralized command structures, allowing rapid decision-making in the field. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance teams improved, leading to effective counterattacks and selective offensives that disrupted Russian momentum. Civilians continued to provide critical support, transporting supplies under cover of darkness, sheltering displaced families, and even assisting with engineering tasks to maintain defensive structures. These efforts blurred the line between military and civilian spheres, creating a network of resistance that leveraged local knowledge, improvisation, and community solidarity. By mid-spring, the front lines had become a dynamic and fluid environment. Small-scale offensives and counteroffensives shifted territorial control repeatedly, leaving villages and towns as contested zones where both sides fought relentlessly. The psychological dimension of warfare grew in importance. Propaganda, information warfare, and morale building became as vital as physical control of territory. Ukrainian commanders recognized that sustaining the fighting spirit of their troops and the civilian population was critical for survival. Even minor victories, such as retaking a small village or successfully ambushing a supply convoy, were amplified to maintain confidence and resilience. Russian forces, meanwhile, faced growing frustration as their attempt at rapid breakthroughs were repeatedly slowed by weather, terrain, and adaptive Ukrainian tactics. The international dimension of the conflict remained complex and high stakes. Western nations increased military aid, intelligence sharing, and logistical support to Ukraine, though they remained cautious about direct involvement to avoid escalation. Diplomatic negotiations and back-channel communications became continuous, as global powers sought to balance strategic interests with the growing humanitarian crisis. Public awareness of the war's toll on civilians, amplified through media coverage and social networks, pressured governments to act more decisively, yet the risk of wider confrontation remained a constant concern. Ukraine had to navigate this political landscape, while simultaneously preparing for large-scale operations and managing the immediate needs of its population. As late spring transitioned into early summer, the conflict reached a new level of intensity. Both sides prepared for major campaigns that could determine regional control. Ukrainian forces launched coordinated offensives designed to reclaim territory lost in previous months, using intelligence-driven precision strikes to disrupt Russian logistics and communications. Russian units countered with artillery barrages and mechanized maneuvers aimed at overwhelming defensive positions. The fighting was relentless, often devolving into street-to-street, building-to-building combat in urban areas. Every village, road junction, and bridge became strategically vital, and the human cost escalated sharply. Civilians remained caught in the crossfire, forced to evacuate repeatedly, while those who stayed endured shortages of food, water, and medical care. The spring and early summer of 2026 underscored the interplay between strategy, terrain, and human endurance in modern warfare. Ukrainian forces leveraged their knowledge of the environment, adaptability, and community support to counteract disadvantages in equipment and numbers, while Russian forces relied on firepower and mobility to seek decisive gains. Attrition, logistics, and the psychological dimension of combat shaped every decision, and success often hinged on small, precise actions executed with discipline and ingenuity. The conflict demonstrated that while technology and heavy equipment are important, human resilience, tactical creativity, and civilian collaboration can be equally decisive in determining the course of a war. By the summer of 2026, both sides had endured months of relentless combat, harsh environmental conditions, and immense human suffering. Ukrainian forces had preserved key defensive positions, mounted effective counteroffensives, and maintained morale under extreme pressure. Russian units, despite superior firepower, faced mounting attrition, logistical challenges, and the unpredictability of adaptive Ukrainian tactics. Civilians, although devastated by displacement and deprivation, remained active participants in survival and resistance. The war had entered a phase where endurance, adaptability, and strategic ingenuity determined outcomes, as much as artillery, tanks, and drones. The lessons of spring and early summer revealed the limits of conventional military superiority and the central role of human resilience in shaping the trajectory of the conflict, foreshadowing the challenges and escalations that the rest of 2026 would inevitably bring. As the dust settled over Normandy, the significance of July 25th, 1944 became undeniable. In just a few hours, one of Germany's most powerful armored divisions was shattered. The path to the breakout lay open, and France's liberation had begun. For the soldiers who survived, both American and German, the memories of that day would echo for a lifetime. History remembers battles, victories, and strategies. But here on Wartime Zone, we remember the people who lived them. If you want more deep-dive war documentaries, forgotten battles, and historical breakdowns, make sure you like, comment, subscribe. because the past is never truly gone. It waits for us to rediscover it. This is Wartime Zone, where history fights to be remembered,